There is a harbour in the Mediterranean that has watched empires rise and fall for 3,000 years. Its limestone walls have absorbed the prayers of Phoenician sailors, the cannon fire of Ottoman fleets, and the quiet grief of mothers waiting for sons who would never come home. Its name is Grand Harbour, Valletta, Malta. And in the summer of 1942, that harbour was waiting again. This time for 14 merchant ships, crossing waters that historians would later call the most heavily defended stretch of ocean in the entire Second World War. This is not a story about strategy alone. It is not a story drawn entirely from the clean lines of staff officer reports. It is the story of a tanker that refused to sink. It is the story of a garrison reduced to 16 ounces of food per person per day, of fighter aircraft towed to runways by trucks because there was not enough fuel to run their own engines, of anti-aircraft batteries rationed to 20 shells a day. It is a story in which the difference between victory and catastrophe was measured in hours, and in the stubborn, irrational will of ordinary men to keep moving forward when every calculation said they should stop. I want you to stay with this story, not because it is heroic, though it is, not because it is dramatic, though it will test every instinct you have for calm, but because it is true, and because the truth of what happened between the 3rd and the 15th of August, 1942, in the waters between Gibraltar and Malta, changes the way you understand the entire North African campaign, changes the way you understand Sicily, changes, if you follow the thread far enough, the way you understand the D-Day landings 2 years later. Everything connects, and it all connects here, in this harbour, in this summer, in this desperate, meticulously planned, brutally executed convoy operation known to the Royal Navy as Operation Pedestal, and known to the people of Malta, who were waiting on the docks with Union Jacks and tears in their eyes, as the Santa Maria convoy. Get comfortable. We are going to be here a while, and I promise you, by the time the last chapter is finished, you will understand exactly why this operation matters. And you will never think about the word supply line in quite the same way again. Chapter 1. The rock in the middle of everything. To understand why 50 ships were pointed at one small island in August of 1942, you first have to understand what that island was. Malta is not large. The entire landmass covers roughly 122 square miles, smaller than the city of Leeds, smaller than the borough of Birmingham. It sits in the narrow corridor of the central Mediterranean, approximately 58 miles south of Sicily, and roughly 200 miles north of the Libyan coast. On a map, it looks almost accidental. A chip of limestone dropped into the sea between two continents. But in 1942, that chip of limestone occupied the most strategically important single point in the entire Mediterranean theatre of war. The reason was simple and brutal. Malta was the only base from which British submarines, aircraft and surface warships could strike at the supply lines, keeping Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces alive in the North African desert. Those supply lines ran from Italian ports southward across the Mediterranean to Libya, and they were the artery through which flowed the fuel, ammunition, food and reinforcements that kept the Afrika Korps in the field. Disrupt those lines and Rommel starved. Allow them to flow freely, and the British Eighth Army in Egypt faced an enemy who could fight indefinitely. From the summer of 1941 to the summer of 1942, the balance of that equation shifted back and forth with terrible violence, and at the pivot of every shift was Malta. The island's effectiveness as an offensive base was remarkable. Between the 1st of June and the 31st of October 1941, British forces operating from Malta sank approximately 220,000 long tons of Axis shipping on the African convoy routes, roughly 94,000 long tons by the Royal Navy, and a further 115,000 long tons by the Royal Air Force and Fleet Air Arm combined. Malta-based squadrons were responsible for approximately 75% of all Axis ships sunk by aircraft across that period. These are not trivial figures. Rommel himself, in his own private correspondence, attributed his logistical crises repeatedly to what he called the English airmen on Malta. The Germans and Italians understood this perfectly. The island was not simply a nuisance. It was an existential threat to the entire Axis position in North Africa. The response was the Siege of Malta, a sustained air campaign of ferocious intensity that began in earnest in January 1941, when the Luftwaffe transferred significant forces to Sicily and Sardinia, and continued with only brief interruptions through 1942. Almost every building on the island was damaged or destroyed. The civilian population sheltered in limestone tunnels and caves. Soldiers and airmen lived in dugouts, emerging under regular bombing to man their positions. What makes Malta's situation historically unusual, and this is a point that some military historians debate with considerable heat, is the degree to which the civilian population was integrated into the defense, not as passive victims, but as participants. The island's geography meant there was nowhere to evacuate. The Maltese people had no option but to endure. And endure they did, with a stubbornness that the British government eventually recognized formally and without precedent. On the 15th of April, 1942, King George VI awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest decoration for civilian bravery, not to an individual but to an entire island. It remains the only time in history that a collective population has received that particular honor. But honors do not fill fuel tanks. And by the late summer of 1942, the situation had gone beyond heroic endurance and into something much more clinical and dangerous: starvation and the imminent collapse of all defensive capacity. The island's aviation fuel reserves were almost gone. The fighters that protected the harbour could no longer fly offensive patrols. The submarines that had been terrorizing Axis convoys were running dry. Malta's remarkable effectiveness as a strike base had, for the moment, been extinguished. The rock in the middle of everything had become, effectively, an expensive prison. What I find striking, and what I think often gets glossed over in popular accounts, is how precise the timeline was. This was not a vague crisis building toward an uncertain end. Governor-General Lord Gort sent a signal to Winston Churchill that was as clear as a death sentence. Food and fuel stocks would be exhausted by the 21st of August, 1942, despite severe rationing. He could not guarantee Malta's safety after that date. This signal arrived in London at a moment when the British war effort was already under enormous strain. Churchill's response would define the next 3 months of the Mediterranean War. Chapter 2. The Weight of an Empire's Calculation. There is a certain kind of decision that military historians call irreversible, the kind where the moment you commit, you have already accepted the full range of possible consequences, including the worst ones. The decision to mount Operation Pedestal was one of those decisions, and it was made with full knowledge of what it might cost. The Admiralty's planning began in late July 1942, under the direction of Vice Admiral Neville Seifert, working alongside Rear Admirals Lumley Leicester and Harold Burrow and the naval staff. Seifert convened his initial conference at Scapa Flow on the 29th of July for flag and commanding officers of all the naval forces involved in the operation. A gathering that represented some of the most experienced sea commanders Britain had produced in this war. What they were being asked to plan was, in essence, a corridor of steel through the most heavily defended stretch of ocean in the world, with the goal of delivering critical supplies to an island everyone agreed could not be allowed to fall. The convoy that emerged from that planning process comprised 14 merchant vessels. The most important, and from the very beginning everyone understood this, was Ohio, the only large, fast tanker available. Ohio was an American-owned ship, built for the Texas Oil Company and loaned to the British for this operation. She had been fitted with additional armament and would be crewed entirely by British volunteer merchant seamen, commanded by a 40-year-old master mariner named Captain Dudley Mason. Ohio carried approximately 12,000 long tons of high-octane aviation fuel, the single commodity without which Malta's aircraft could not fly, and the island's entire defensive capacity would collapse within days. As insurance against her possible loss, planners arranged for the other merchant ships to carry additional fuel in drums, a stopgap measure that every planner knew was wholly inadequate if Ohio was sunk. The escort force assembled for Pedestal was unlike anything the Royal Navy had put together before in the Mediterranean. 2 battleships, HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, each displacing 34,000 tons and armed with 9 16-inch guns, would form the core of the heavy covering force, designated Force C, under Sifret's direct command. 3 aircraft carriers, HMS Indomitable, HMS Victorious, and HMS Eagle, would provide air cover, embarking between them a mixed force of Sea Hurricanes, Martlets, Fulmars, and Albacores. 7 cruisers, 32 destroyers, and 7 submarines rounded out the escort. The total force, approximately 50 ships. The entire enterprise was designated Force F, the close escort for the merchant vessels through the most dangerous passage. The Sicilian Narrows and the final approach to Malta was designated Force X under Rear Admiral Burrough. This was the force that would remain with the merchants after the heavy covering group turned back at the Skirky Narrows, the point where the waters become too confined and too dangerous for battleships and fleet carriers. It is worth pausing on this detail because it is one of the operational choices that historians have returned to with greatest frequency. The moment Force C turned back, Burroughs' cruisers and destroyers would be alone with the merchants in the most hazardous stretch of water, with no battleships, no carriers, and Axis torpedo boats, submarines, and aircraft converging from multiple directions simultaneously. The ships were loaded at the River Clyde in Scotland. On board the Ohio, Captain Mason briefed his crew with a directness that has been preserved in several accounts, and that carries, across the decades, the weight of a man who knew exactly what he was asking. He told them their destination. He told them they would have to fight with 13,000 tons of high-octane fuel on board. He paused and asked if anyone wanted to leave. No one moved. The Admiralty had attached a letter to the briefing, signed by the First Sea Lord, expressing gratitude to the crews and framing the operation in terms of Malta's courage and the Empire's need. It is the kind of formal language that can feel distant and institutional, until you read it against the background of what those men were about to enter. The convoy sailed from the River Clyde on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of August, 1942. The ships formed up in 3 parallel columns and set course southward for Gibraltar. Additional anti-aircraft weapons had been mounted on the merchant ship's decks, and Royal Navy and Maritime Regiment gun crews conducted constant exercises during the passage south. On the first morning at sea, the crews were told their destination. The Bay of Biscay was crossed without serious incident. German U-boats and Focke-Wulf bombers were present, but the convoy's scale apparently gave attackers pause, and the skirmishes that occurred were swiftly suppressed by the destroyer escorts. It was the last stretch of relatively quiet water these men would see. On the morning of the 9th of August, 1942, Force F passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean. Rear Admiral Burrough flashed a signal from his flagship HMS Nigeria to every ship in the convoy. It read, "All ships to action stations until further notice." The Mediterranean War had been fought for 2 years in these waters. Every man who served in it knew that the Mediterranean had no quiet corners and no forgiveness. Chapter 3. The Fortress That Was Also a Cage. Before we follow the convoy further east, I want to take a step back, because to fully appreciate the stakes of what was crossing that water, you need to understand what Malta had already endured in the months and years before August 1942. This is not background noise. This is the reason everything else happened. The siege of Malta began in earnest in the summer of 1940, when Italian bombers first targeted the island's airfields and harbour. In those early months, the Italian Regia Aeronautica flew hundreds of sorties against a garrison that had almost nothing with which to fight back. Malta's initial fighter defense consisted of a handful of obsolete Gloucester Gladiator biplanes. 3 of them, according to legend, though the historiographical record on this specific detail is somewhat more complex, and serious Malta scholars have argued the precise numbers with some vigor. What is not in dispute is the disparity between what Malta had and what was being thrown at it, and the fact that the island endured. The strategic logic of the siege was clear to both sides. Malta dominated the central Mediterranean choke point. For the Axis powers, neutralizing it was a prerequisite for securing the supply lines to North Africa. For the British, holding it was the key to interdicting those same supply lines, and, ultimately, to defeating Rommel. Each side understood this with perfect clarity, and the result was a sustained and systematic attempt to destroy the island's capacity to resist, while the British made increasingly costly efforts to keep it supplied. From August 1940 to the end of August 1942, 670 Hurricane and Spitfire fighters had been flown off aircraft carriers in the Western Mediterranean in attempts to reinforce Malta's air defense. 19 aircraft carrier ferry operations, known informally as club runs, had been conducted at considerable risk and cost. 46 ships had delivered 320,000 long tons of supplies over the same period, but 25 ships had been sunk in the attempt. 31 supply runs by submarines had been conducted specifically to deliver the most critical items: aviation fuel, anti-aircraft ammunition, medical stores, and torpedoes. Through the tightening blockade, the submarines themselves sometimes arrived half-flooded with the effort. By early 1942, the aerial bombardment had reached an intensity that drew unfavorable comparisons, even with the London Blitz. The Luftwaffe units transferred to Sicily in late 1941 subjected Malta to sustained day and night bombing that reduced most of the surface buildings in the harbour area to rubble. The civilian population, roughly 300,000 people, had no option but to go underground. An extraordinary network of limestone tunnels and natural caves became effectively a parallel city beneath the one being destroyed on the surface. Food rationing produced a daily intake for adult male workers of 1,690 calories, well below the minimum required for sustained physical labour. Women and children received 1,500 calories. In August, a mass slaughter of livestock began to reduce the need for animal fodder imports, and the meat was distributed through what the authorities called victory kitchens. Aviation fuel was the most critical shortage of all, and it shaped every operational decision made by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, the island's air commander from July 1942. Park, a New Zealander who had commanded 11 Group through the Battle of Britain in 1940, and brought a particular aggressive pragmatism to fighter direction, was forced to keep his aircraft on the ground except when absolutely necessary. Fighters were forbidden to taxi under their own power. They were towed to the runway by trucks. Anti-aircraft batteries were rationed to 20 shells per gun per day. These are the kinds of details that operational histories sometimes reduce to footnotes, but they represent something important. The degradation of a military force that could still fight, but only barely, and only if it received help within a specific window of time. That window was not open-ended. The Admiralty's own assessment and Lord Gort's blunt signal to Churchill established a specific date after which Malta could not continue. The 21st of August, 1942. Operation Pedestal sailed from the Clyde on the night of the 2nd and 3rd of August. The margin was, at maximum, approximately 18 days. Given the transit time from Gibraltar and the certainty of Axis attack, the practical margin was considerably shorter. The planning staff at the Admiralty understood this. It is why the escort force was built to a scale unprecedented in the Mediterranean. It is why the risk was accepted. Malta could not be replaced. There was no strategic redundancy, no fallback position, no alternative base that would serve the same function. The rock was the only rock there was. Chapter 4. The enemy side of the equation. One of the things that makes Operation Pedestal so absorbing as a historical case study, and here I am genuinely following the operational records rather than constructing a convenient narrative, is how well prepared the Axis response was, and how structurally limited it was at the same time. The Axis command structure in the Mediterranean was, to put it plainly, a bureaucratic nightmare. Benito Mussolini had concentrated authority over all three Italian armed services in his own hands since 1933, holding simultaneously the portfolios of Minister of War, Minister of the Navy, and Minister of the Air Force. Below him, the German Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring commanded German ground forces in the theatre as Commander-in-Chief South, but held no authority over operations in North Africa or the organization of supply convoys to Libya. The Italian Navy, Supermarina, actively resisted German attempts to integrate operations and ships from different Italian squadrons, never trained together. Inter-service rivalry between the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine further complicated coordination. This is not a detail that changes the outcome of any single engagement, but it accumulated, over the course of a multi-day convoy battle, into something significant. What the Axis did have, as the convoy sailed south from the Clyde, was substantial intelligence. Ship-watching stations near Gibraltar reported movements into and out of the strait with considerable accuracy. On the 5th of August, Abwehr assessments had already convinced Kesselring that a major supply operation to Malta was being prepared. By the morning of the 10th of August, German and Italian reconnaissance aircraft had identified the convoy clearly. Approximately 50 ships, including carriers and battleships, sailing eastward in the western Mediterranean. The Axis response was in motion before the convoy had even reached the Balearic Islands. The Axis air forces assembled for the operation were formidable by any measure. The Regia Aeronautica deployed 328 aircraft across Sardinia and Sicily, comprising 90 torpedo bombers, 62 conventional bombers, 25 dive bombers, and 151 fighters. The Luftwaffe contributed 456 aircraft, predominantly dive bombers, but including substantial medium bomber and fighter elements. Additionally, approximately 20 Junkers Ju-88 aircraft from Fliegerkorps X on Crete were transferred westward during the battle itself, a transfer that required real-time coordination across operational commands. The total figure of approximately 700 aircraft available against the convoy is a number worth dwelling on, because the RAF's entire Malta-based fighter strength at this point was roughly 100 Spitfires. The Italian Navy's position was more constrained than the air order of battle suggests. Supermarina had prepared two cruiser divisions, the 3rd and 7th, along with destroyer screens, and planned their intervention for the final phase of the convoy's passage through the Sicilian Narrows, when the British covering force would have already turned back for Gibraltar and Burroughs cruisers would be alone. But the Italian battleships, which on paper constituted an overwhelming surface force, were non-operational. The reason was prosaic and damning: fuel. The Italian Navy had received only 12,000 long tons of fuel oil in June 1942, approximately 20% of its operational consumption rate. The battleships could not sail. This is one of the great ironies of the Italian naval campaign. A fleet that might have been decisive was grounded by the same supply crisis it was supposed to be helping to perpetuate. Axis submarine deployments were extensive and carefully planned. 19 submarines in the Western Mediterranean were positioned in coordinated patrol lines designed to force the convoy to take evasive action, break formation, and present separated targets to the air and surface forces that would follow. German U-boats and Italian boats operated in their respective areas, with instructions to report sightings and attack when opportunity presented. The Axis also planned to use torpedo boats, German E-boats, and Italian MAS and MS craft, positioned off Cape Bon, in the narrows between Sicily and Tunisia, where any ship that survived the submarine and air gauntlet would have to pass in a confined channel with limited room to maneuver. What I find genuinely remarkable, and this is a point where operational analysts have differed, so I want to present it honestly, is that the Axis plan was, in concept, well constructed: 4 successive barriers, submarines in the Western Basin, coordinated air attacks across Sardinia and Sicily, torpedo boats in the Narrows, and a surface cruiser force to complete the destruction. The plan assumed that each barrier would degrade the convoy further, and that by the time the Italian cruisers engaged, they would be dealing with a scattered, damaged remnant. The plan assumed, in other words, that the British convoy would behave like previous British convoys. It would not. Chapter 5. Eagle Falls. I want to be precise about timing here, because the sequence of what happened on the 11th of August 1942 matters enormously to understanding how quickly the balance of the battle could tip, and how much depended on decisions made in fractions of minutes by men who had very little information and very little time. The convoy had entered the Mediterranean on the night of the 9th and 10th of August, without incident, aided by dense fog and a moonless sky that made detection from the Moroccan and Spanish shores difficult. The Abwehr agents near Gibraltar and Ceuta had nonetheless sighted the convoy, and the British, reading the same messages through their Enigma decryption capability, knew that the Axis were well informed. There is something almost vertiginous about this aspect of the intelligence war. The British knew that the Axis knew, and the Axis knew a British operation was coming, and both sides prepared accordingly while maintaining the formal pretense of operational surprise. By dawn on the 11th of August, the convoy was south of the Balearic Islands, sailing due east on a zigzag course. Refueling operations had been completed through the night. Previous Malta convoys had refueled on arrival, but Malta now had no oil to spare, so the tankers Dingledale and Brown Ranger accompanied the convoy as a mobile fuel reserve. At the same time, the carrier HMS Furious conducted what was known as a club run. Between 12:30 and 3:15 in the afternoon, she flew off 38 Spitfire fighters for the 555 to 584 nautical mile journey to Malta, then turned back for Gibraltar with her escorts. 37 of the Spitfires reached the island. This operation proceeded successfully, and in other circumstances, it would be the day's main event. It was not. At 8 o'clock in the morning, a German submarine had sighted ships at the convoy's edge, but found them out of range. Behind the main group, however, another cluster of vessels was moving in a slightly different pattern, and trailing behind them came the carrier HMS Eagle. Eagle was the oldest of the 3 carriers in the force, built originally as a Chilean battleship and completed as a carrier in 1923. She had been one of Malta's most important suppliers of Spitfire reinforcements over the previous 18 months, having dispatched 183 fighters to the island during her service in the Mediterranean. The German submarine U-73, commanded by Lieutenant Helmut Rosenbaum, maneuvered submerged within 400 yards of Eagle's hull, and at 13:15 hours fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 struck. Eagle capsized and sank in 8 minutes, going down approximately 70 nautical miles south of Cape Salinas. Of her complement of 1,160 officers and men, 929 were rescued by the destroyers HMS Lookout, HMS Laffery, and the fleet tug Jaunty. 231 men were lost, along with all but 4 of her sea hurricanes. Those 4 happened to be airborne at the moment the torpedoes struck. The loss of Eagle eliminated approximately 20% of the convoy's total fighter cover at a stroke. U-73 escaped. The layered thermal gradients of the Western Mediterranean, where bodies of water at different temperatures create acoustic anomalies that confuse ASDIC sonar returns, are one plausible technical explanation for why the U-boat avoided the destroyer's countermeasures. The official records note that after the torpedoing, escort vessels reported frequent false ASDIC contacts, a phenomenon consistent with thermal layering. This is the kind of technical detail that matters operationally, but rarely makes the popular histories. The sea itself was working against the defenders in ways they could not fully control. The convoy reformed and pressed east. At just after 8 in the evening, with the convoy approximately 200 nautical miles from Sardinia, the first major air attack came in. 27 Junkers Ju-88 bombers and 3 Heinkel He-111 torpedo aircraft attacked at dusk. The Heinkels flew very low to drop their torpedoes. The Ju-88s came in shallow dives out of the fading light, exploiting the angle at which the convoy's fighters would have the most difficulty intercepting. Anti-aircraft fire from the convoy shot down 2 of the bombers, for no losses among the merchant ships. During the night, RAF Liberators and Beaufighters attacked Axis airfields in Sardinia, setting a hangar on fire and destroying several aircraft. A commando raid on a Sicilian airfield the same night, however, failed to achieve its objectives. Before the first night of the convoy's Mediterranean passage was over, a second significant event had occurred beneath the surface. HMS Wolverine, part of the escort for the returning Furious, had been detached with 4 destroyers for anti-submarine patrols following Eagle's loss. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, Wolverine detected the Italian submarine Dagobah, obtained a visual contact at 700 yards, accelerated, and rammed the submarine at 27 knots, sinking it with all hands. The Italian submarine had been attempting to attack Furious on her return to Gibraltar. The loss of Eagle and the sinking of Dagobah established the brutal arithmetic of what lay ahead. Every hour on these waters was a transaction in lives and ships, and the convoy had been in the Mediterranean for less than 48 hours. Chapter 6. The 12th of August, the long day. The 12th of August, 1942, is the day that most operational accounts of Pedestal circle around like historians afraid to look directly at the sun. It lasted, in terms of continuous attack, from before dawn to after midnight, and by its end the convoy had been so fundamentally altered in composition and capacity that everything that followed existed in a different strategic register entirely. Axis aircraft resumed shadowing the convoy at 5 o'clock in the morning. German reconnaissance aircraft flew high and fast. Too high and too fast for the carrier's fighters to intercept, and watched the convoy throughout the early hours, feeding position reports back to the assembled air and naval forces waiting across Sardinia and Sicily. At 9:15 in the morning, when the convoy was approximately 130 nautical miles southwest of Sardinia, 19 Junkers, 80 dive bombers of Lehrgeschwader 1 were intercepted 25 nautical miles out by Fleet Air Arm fighters. 4 of the Ju-88s were shot down, with German records confirming 5 total losses, including 2 from mechanical failure over Sardinia, in exchange for 1 British fighter. The German crews filed enthusiastic damage claims that subsequent assessment would not substantiate. What the morning's patrol also confirmed was that the Italian cruiser force was at sea. Beaufighters returning from a strike on Sardinia cited the 7th Cruiser Division, 3 light cruisers, and their destroyer screen, moving south from Cagliari into the Tyrrhenian Sea. Reconnaissance aircraft from Malta confirmed that the 3rd Cruiser Division had departed from Messina. This was the surface force that Supermarina had prepared for the final phase of the battle, and its early deployment suggested that Italian planning anticipated the convoy entering the Narrows in a degraded condition by the end of the day. Air Vice Marshal Park on Malta was alerted and held his torpedo bomber strike force, 15 Beaufort aircraft and 15 Beaufighters, at readiness. The chess pieces were moving toward each other. The midday attacks were the day's heaviest and most complex. Between noon and early afternoon, successive waves of Italian aircraft from Sardinia descended on the convoy in a pattern of remarkable technical sophistication, if decidedly mixed results. 10 SM-184 bombers came first, accompanied by CR-42 fighter bombers and MC-202 escorts. Then, 9 SM-.79 torpedo bombers attacked the starboard side of the convoy, while another formation attacked the port side simultaneously. The coordinated pincer, designed to force the merchant ships into whichever torpedo run they tried to avoid. A second wave had been delayed by 15 minutes due to a shortage of ground mechanics for the Re.2001 fighters. A logistics failure that is so mundane and so consequential that I find it genuinely representative of how wars are actually fought. The third wave included what may be the most technologically audacious element of the entire day's fighting. A pair of Ray 2001 fighter bombers from an elite unit called the Sezione Speciale, carrying armor-piercing bombs, escorted by a radio-controlled SM.79, loaded with a single 2,200-pound bomb, to be guided by remote control into an aircraft carrier. The radio control system failed. The SM-79 flew straight past the convoy and eventually crashed into a mountain in Algeria. The fighter bombers, mistaken for friendly hurricanes in the confusion, did reach the carrier HMS Victorious. One bomb killed 6 sailors and wounded 2. The other bounced off the armoured deck and exploded harmlessly over the sea. An armoured carrier deck had at that moment saved the entire operation. Between the Italian waves, 37 Junkers Ju 88 aircraft from 2 Kampfgeschwader formations attacked from the direction of Sicily, having used radio countermeasures to interfere with British radar on Malta before approach. 5 aircraft had turned back with mechanical problems, but the remainder evaded the carrier-based Fulmars and reached the convoy. The merchant ship Deucalion was hit and forced out of the main convoy body, escorted by a single destroyer. The sheer quantity of anti-aircraft fire across the convoy had, however, produced an operationally significant effect. Many Axis aircrew were releasing their bombs and torpedoes early, well outside effective range, and turning back before pressing home their attacks. The number of sorties, 117 Italian and 58 German, had produced results that Fliegerkorps II's own assessment characterized as meager. The late afternoon brought the day's most costly blow, and it came not from the air, but from beneath the surface. In the last light, as the convoy approached the Narrows, 2 Italian submarines, working in close coordination, maneuvered through the destroyer screen. Torpedoes struck simultaneously the cruisers HMS Cairo and HMS Nigeria, and the tanker Ohio. Cairo was so badly damaged she had to be abandoned. Nigeria, Rear Admiral Burroughs' own flagship, turned back toward Gibraltar with 3 destroyers, removing the force's senior commander from the immediate battle at the worst possible moment. Ohio was struck near the bow on the starboard side. Her steering gear was disabled. Communications between bridge and engine room were severed, and eventually her engines went silent. As the convoy pressed on through the gathering dark, Ohio fell behind, drifting, her decks awash with the smell of aviation fuel, her engines dead. Burrow transferred his flag to the destroyer HMS Ashanti, and the convoy entered the Narrows. During the night, Italian torpedo boats and German E-boats swept in from the Sicilian coast in successive attacks, sinking 4 more merchant ships and severely damaging the cruiser HMS Manchester, which would have to be abandoned. By the time the first pale light touched the horizon on the 13th of August, the convoy that had sailed through Gibraltar with 14 merchants and 50 warships was, in the Narrows between Tunisia and Sicily, a battered, diminished remnant. But it was still moving, and somewhere astern, drifting in the dark, Ohio was still afloat. Chapter 7. The Narrows, where the sea became a killing ground. There is a passage of water between the western tip of Sicily and the Tunisian coast near Cape Bon that measures, at its narrowest point, roughly 140 nautical miles across. Wide enough, you might think, for a fleet of ships to pass with room to spare. But width is not the problem in the Sicilian Narrows. The problem is depth and current and the limestone shelf that forces ships into specific channels. And the fact that those channels were, on the night of the 12th and 13th of August, 1942, filled with approximately 23 Italian torpedo boats, MAS craft and MS craft, and a number of German E-boats waiting with their engines at idle, their crews lying flat on the deck to reduce their silhouettes against the darkness. Rear Admiral Burrow had known this moment was coming since the planning conferences at Scapa Flow. The Narrows were the structural weakness of the entire operation, the point where geography itself worked against the defender and for the attacker. A convoy that could maneuver freely in the open ocean became, in the Narrows, something closer to a column of vehicles on a single road, each ship following the ship ahead, unable to vary course dramatically without risk of collision or grounding. The destroyers that were supposed to screen against torpedo boats needed sea room to work their best tactics at high speed. In the Narrows, they had no such room. The attack that developed during the late evening of the 12th and the early hours of the 13th was not a single coordinated assault. It was a series of individual engagements in the dark, separated by intervals of bewildering quiet. Each incident leaving the merchant ships less certain of what formation they were in and where the threat would come from next. The Italian torpedo boats operated in pairs and small groups, approaching on silent engines, firing at close range, and accelerating away before the destroyers could establish firm contacts. Radar returns at close range in confined waters were cluttered and uncertain. The destroyer commanders were making decisions on the basis of incomplete picture with every action. What happened over those hours was, in the operational record, a sequence of losses that defies any simple description. The merchant vessel Clan Ferguson was struck and caught fire, her cargo, which included aviation fuel and ammunition, producing an explosion visible from the Sicilian shore. The Empire Hope was torpedoed and sank. The Glenorchy went down. The Santa Elisa, an American crude merchant ship, was caught by a torpedo boat and set on fire. Almeria Lykes was struck and lost. What is particularly important to understand, and what the raw list of ships lost sometimes obscures, is that these losses were not occurring in sequence over a calm hour. They were occurring simultaneously, in different parts of the channel, in the dark, in the middle of a battle in which communications between ships were fragmentary, and the precise position of friendly vessels was often unknown. The cruiser HMS Manchester was struck by 2 torpedoes from the Italian submarine Axum, which had already torpedoed Nigeria and Cairo and Ohio earlier in the evening, during the Narrows Passage. The damage to Manchester was such that her captain, CAG Manwaring, assessed the ship as unable to make port and ordered her scuttling. This decision would later be reviewed in a court-martial that acquitted Manwaring, but generated one of the most protracted debates in Royal Navy disciplinary history about the standard expected of commanding officers facing catastrophic damage in action. I raise it not to adjudicate the decision, but because it illustrates how much the Narrows Passage compressed every possible emergency into a single violent window, forcing decisions that would have been agonizing under any circumstances. Burroughs' force had entered the Narrows with 10 merchant ships and 6 cruisers and 12 destroyers. By the time the first pale light began to distinguish sea from sky on the morning of the 13th, 5 merchant ships had been sunk and 1 cruiser lost. The remaining 5 merchant ships, Rochester Castle, Melbourne Star, Wimarama, Dorset, and Port Chalmers, were scattered in the darkness, some steaming independently, none fully aware of the others' positions, and all of them some distance from their original course lines. Burroughs' immediate and pressing problem was that his force had no way of establishing full communications with these scattered ships before daylight brought the next round of air attacks. One additional fact requires noting here. The tanker Ohio, torpedoed by the Italian submarine Axum the previous evening in the western approach to the Narrows, had by this point been reached by the minesweeper HMS Rye. Captain Mason had restored some emergency steering capacity through the night, but Ohio's engines remained non-operational, and her bow section was severely damaged. She was making minimal forward progress. She was, in military terms, a liability, a ship that required escort and assistance that the depleted force could barely spare. And yet she carried the 12,000 tons of aviation fuel, without which everything the convoy had gone through was operationally meaningless. The men on Ohio understood this. They stayed with their ship. Chapter 8, Dawn Attacks and the Final Run. There is something almost clinical about the way the war resumed at first light on the 13th of August, 1942. The night's violence had been intimate and confused, fought in darkness at close quarters, with the sound of explosions and the smell of burning fuel on the water. Dawn brought a different kind of attack entirely. Organized, coordinated airstrikes flown by professional aircrew, who had spent the night sleeping and eating, while their targets had spent it under fire. The asymmetry is worth sitting with for a moment. The Axis air forces were fighting a shift. The men on those merchant ships were simply not stopping. At 8:30 in the morning, a formation of Junkers Jew 88 bombers struck the scattered convoy in the stretch of water east of the Narrows, between the Cape Bon Peninsula and the Sicilian coast. The first strike killed the merchant vessel Wimarama. A near miss detonated the high-octane fuel in her cargo, and the resulting explosion was so catastrophic that of her crew of 107, only 22 survived. The destroyer HMS Ledbury turned back toward the burning wreck, circling through a sea on fire to pull survivors from the water. The officer commanding Ledbury kept his ship in the burning area far longer than standard doctrine would have suggested was prudent. 13 men were rescued from the water inside the burning slick. Most of the survivors of the convoy later cited Ledbury's conduct at this point as one of the moments that demonstrated what the escort was actually doing out there. Melbourne Star was struck shortly afterwards and set on fire. Her captain, David McFarlane, gave the order to abandon ship, then countermanded it when the fire appeared to stabilize, recalling his crew and pressing on toward Malta. This happened, I want to emphasize that, a merchant master recalled his crew from the sea, back onto a burning ship, and sailed her the remaining distance to Malta. Melbourne Star reached Grand Harbour at 3:30 in the afternoon of the 13th, still smoking, carrying her cargo intact. The harbour gun crews came to attention. People on the Valletta waterfront, those who had made it to the upper Baraka Gardens to watch, reportedly began to weep. Meanwhile, Ohio was going through her own separate ordeal. separated from the main group and under repeated individual air attacks. A Junkers Ju-88 dive bomber scored a direct hit and lodged an unexploded bomb in her engine room. The bomb later detonated, blowing a large hole in her hull. A second attack dropped a bomb through her deck that detonated internally, stopping her engines completely and blowing off her rudder. An Italian aircraft, apparently hit by anti-aircraft fire, crashed into her deck and burned there, adding aviation fuel from the aircraft's tanks to the already considerable fire risk on a ship that was essentially a floating tank of high-octane petrol. An American or British naval architect told the structural state of Ohio on the morning of the 13th would probably have told you she could not float for another 6 hours. She floated for 2 more days. HMS Dorset was attacked multiple times and repeatedly altered course under fire, eventually taking hits that brought her to a stop south of the convoy route. The destroyer HMS Bramham was ordered to assist. Dorset's captain requested a tow, but the towing hawsers parted repeatedly, and further air attacks made the approach impossible to sustain. Eventually, with further air attack clearly imminent, and the damage beyond correction, Dorset sank. The crew were taken off by Bramham. This sequence, a ship that survived through extraordinary effort, and then was lost when the effort ran out, is not heroic narrative. It is what sustained attrition over 5 days actually looks like when you follow individual ships rather than the aggregate totals. The air attacks on the 13th also demonstrated something important about how the balance of fighter cover had shifted since Eagle's loss. The carriers had remained with Force C and turned back at the Narrows, which meant that the merchant ships now had no carrier-based fighter protection at all. Malta-based Spitfires provided some cover near the island, but their range was limited and they could not reach the ships in the outer stretches of the central basin. The destroyer escorts had anti-aircraft weapons and made excellent use of them, but they could not substitute for fighters. Several attacks came in with minimal opposition because there was simply nothing to oppose them. The arithmetic of the operation, which had assigned 3 carriers partly to compensate for the vulnerability of the Narrows transit, had been disrupted by Eagle's loss early on the 11th, and the convoy was now paying for that disruption over the final 48 hours of the run. By the afternoon of the 13th, 3 merchant ships, Rochester Castle, Port Chalmers, and Melbourne Star, had reached Grand Harbour. Together, they carried sufficient food and military stores to meaningfully extend Malta's survival. Aviation fuel was not among their cargoes in adequate quantity. For that, everything still depended on Ohio, and Ohio was sitting dead in the water, approximately 60 nautical miles from Malta, with destroyers HMS Penn and HMS Bramham attempting to establish a tow, while her crew worked in the engine room, trying by any means available to restore propulsion. Chapter 9, Ohio. A ship that would not die. I want to deal with Ohio as its own chapter because she deserves it. Not in the sense of sentiment, though sentiment is entirely appropriate, but in the sense that her story is operationally separate from the convoy battle's broader flow, and that what happened to her over the 13th, 14th, and 15th of August, 1942, is one of the most precisely documented individual ship's survival stories in the entire Second World War. It holds up to scrutiny in detail, and the detail is what makes it remarkable. Ohio had been built in 1940 at the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company's yard in Chester, Pennsylvania, for the Texas Oil Company. She was a tanker of 16,500 gross registered tons, 935 feet long, purpose-built for speed as well as capacity. Her maximum speed under full power was 16 knots, fast for a tanker, critical for convoy work. Her design included a double bottom and a longitudinal framing system that was, according to the maritime historians who have examined her construction records in some depth, unusually robust for a vessel of her type and period. Whether this structural robustness is what allowed her to absorb the punishment she received over 4 days is one of those analytical questions that cannot be answered definitively. What can be established is that she took damage that would have sunk most ships, and she stayed afloat. The first torpedo had hit on the evening of the 12th, striking the starboard bow and flooding compartments forward of the bridge. The unexploded bomb that lodged in her engine room on the morning of the 13th was particularly significant. It detonated after what the engineering staff aboard believed was approximately 20 minutes, blowing a hole in the engine room plating and disabling the main propulsion. A further bomb hit went through her deck and exploded internally, breaking her keel, the structural spine of the ship, and causing her to acquire a visible hogging strain, her bow and stern curving slightly upward from the midpoint. By any structural standard, a ship with a broken keel is a ship that is dying. The only question is how fast. Ohio did not go quickly. Captain Dudley Mason had remained on his bridge through all of it. The accounts given by surviving crew members describe a man of almost preternatural steadiness, not apparently cold, but operating in a register beyond agitation, making and communicating decisions in a clear, unhurried voice, while the world around his ship was conducting a sustained argument for why it should sink. Mason ordered constant damage control. He ordered the engine room crew back to the machinery repeatedly through the attacks. He ordered hatches sealed and counterflooding of intact compartments to compensate for the flooding of damaged ones. When you read the court deposition and the survivor testimonies, what you notice is not dramatic courage of the flag-waving variety. It is something more like professional obstinacy, the conviction that the problem in front of you is soluble until it demonstrably is not, and that it is not yet demonstrably not. By the afternoon of the 13th, HMS Penn had managed to pass a tow to Ohio and was pulling her at between 2 and 4 knots toward Malta, with HMS Bramham keeping station alongside to help with steering and anti-aircraft defense. But towing a dead ship of Ohio's size and displacement in sea conditions that included swell and intermittent current was technically punishing, and the tow lines were parting regularly. At one point during the night of the 13th to 14th, the tow parted and Ohio swung beam onto the swell and began to drift. The minesweeper HMS Rye attempted to re-establish the tow. For approximately 3 hours in the middle of that night, Ohio lay entirely stopped in open water with no motive power, damaged beyond obvious repair, carrying 12,000 tons of aviation fuel and not sinking. On the morning of the 14th, a novel and somewhat desperate solution was attempted. HMS Penn secured alongside Ohio on the port side, and HMS Bramham secured alongside on the starboard side, creating a 3-ship raft in which the 2 destroyers effectively provided both propulsion and steering for the tanker between them. The combined formation could make approximately 6 knots. This is an unusual piece of naval engineering, improvised under fire on the spot, and it worked. The formation was repeatedly attacked by Italian aircraft during the 14th. Survivors reported counting 9 separate air attacks on that single day. And Ohio's anti-aircraft crews, still at their guns despite the state of the ship around them, continued to engage throughout. HMS Ledbury joined the formation on the morning of the 15th of August, making 4 ships sailing together, 3 moving and 1 being moved, making 6 knots through a flat calm sea under a Mediterranean summer sky. Malta was visible by the time it was light. The characteristic low limestone profile, the dome of the Mosta Rotunda, visible from the water, the harbour mouth between the 2 promontories that have watched ships come and go for 3,000 years, the crews of the destroyers and the tanker, most of whom had not slept in any continuous way since the 9th of August, stood at their positions and watched the island get closer. Ohio entered Grand Harbour at 10 o'clock in the morning. on the 15th of August, 1942, the feast day of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which the Maltese call Il Festa ta Santa Marija, the Festival of Santa Marija. The timing was not planned by the Admiralty. It was the result of 4 days of damage, delay, emergency repairs, and the simply biological fact that men and ships run at the pace they can. The coincidence of the date. The most important religious festival in the Maltese calendar. The day when the island came out of its tunnels and its dugouts and stood in the streets, gave the arrival a quality that no planning conference could have manufactured. The guns on the harbour walls fired a salute. Captain Mason, who had been on his bridge for the better part of 96 hours, reportedly sat down on the bridge deck and put his head in his hands. Chapter 10. Inside the island. What the waiting felt. Like I have followed the ships this far, and I want to turn now, for a full chapter, to the other side of the equation. To the people who were not on the ships, who had no control over what was happening on the water, and who were watching and waiting with the particular helplessness of those for whom the outcome is total, but the agency is zero. Because Operation Pedestal is not only a naval operation, it is also a story about what civilian endurance looks like when it is stretched to its absolute limit over 2 full years. The population of Malta in 1942 numbered approximately 270,000 people. They were not a homogeneous population in cultural terms. The Maltese language is itself a hybrid, a Semitic base, with very extensive Romance overlays, reflecting the island's layered history of Phoenician, Arab, Norman, Aragonese, and eventually British rule. The Catholic faith was, for virtually the entire population, not merely a cultural identifier, but an organizing principle of daily life. Churches were the community centers, the reference points, the gathering places. When the bombing began, it hit the churches. The numbers of sorties flown against Malta during the siege period resist easy summary because they accumulate over more than 2 years into figures that become difficult to visualize. Between the 1st of June 1940 and the end of August 1942, the island sustained approximately 3,343 bombing raids. During the peak month of April 1942, the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica flew approximately 6,728 sorties against Malta, more than had been directed at London during the entire Blitz period. The bomb damage to civilian housing was such that entire streets of the 3 cities, Vittoriosa, Senglea, Cospicua, had ceased to exist. The dockyards that were the primary military target were equally devastated. It is one of the operational ironies of the siege that the dockyards continued to function, because the workers, mostly Maltese civilians, simply kept coming back and cleared the rubble and repaired the installations. The rationing system was administered by the Lieutenant Governor's office and is documented with considerable precision in the Colonial Office records. By early 1942, the adult male bread ration had been cut to 10.5 ounces per day. By the summer, every household received a war kitchen meal once a day, supplemented by minimal home rations. The whole system managed through a network of approximately 250 Victory kitchens distributing standard cooked meals across the island. The calorific intake for manual workers on the dockyard, the men doing the heaviest physical labor maintaining the installations under fire, was calculated by the medical officer of health as falling below the minimum required to sustain that level of work. The men continued anyway. What I find both moving and historically significant is the degree to which the Maltese civilian population maintained normal community structures under conditions that might have been expected to dissolve them. Church festivals were modified rather than cancelled. The annual village festas, which in Malta function as a combination of religious celebration, community competition, and social identity, continued in attenuated form. Schools operated intermittently. The Maltese language newspapers maintained publication, though shortened. There is a sociological literature on resilience under sustained bombardment that sometimes attributes this kind of community cohesion to pre-existing social structures. The density of village networks, the parish church as a physical and spiritual anchor, and Malta is frequently cited as a case study, but it also required choices made by individual people every single day to keep doing ordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. The watching on the harbour walls during the days of August 1942 was something that observers at the time recorded with some frequency. The Maltese had a word for the convoy ships, ilgefen tal provisti, the ships of provisions, though the phrase that attached most powerfully to the operation was the one that came from the feast day of the 15th, the Santa Maria Convoy. People gathered on the Upper Baraka Gardens terrace and on the bastions overlooking Grand Harbour from the morning of the 13th onwards, watching for the silhouettes of ships. The arrival of Rochester Castle, Port Chalmers, and Melbourne Star on the afternoon of the 13th produced scenes that multiple witnesses described in similar terms. A kind of simultaneous relief and grief, joy at the arrival, mixed with the visible evidence of what the ships had been through. Governor-General Lord Gort walked out to the harbour breakwater to meet Ohio in person on the morning of the 15th of August. The image of the Governor-General walking out on the breakwater is preserved in contemporary accounts, and it represents something beyond protocol. Malta's military commander was going to the waterfront because the 15,000 long tons of supplies that had survived the convoy, 5 of the original 14 merchant ships, a total of roughly 55,000 long tons sent, approximately 32,000 long tons arriving, represented the difference between the island continuing to function as a military base and the island surrendering. Gort knew this with absolute precision. The fuel that Ohio delivered reached Malta's aviation wing by a pipeline from dockside that had been kept ready and operational throughout the siege. Within 48 hours of Ohio's arrival, Air Vice Marshal Park had restored his fighters to normal operational flying schedules. Offensive operations against Axis shipping, the interdiction campaign that had been the strategic rationale for defending Malta in the first place, resumed. The chain of consequence that ran from the Clyde in early August to the resumption of Malta-based operations in mid-August is direct and traceable and has no missing links. The convoy worked, but it worked at a price that the Royal Navy calculated with considerable care in its official post-operational analysis. And that price shaped how future operations in the Mediterranean would be planned. Chapter 11. The Accounting. What was lost and what was gained military historians, when they attempt to evaluate an operation like Pedestal, face a particular analytical problem. The operation both succeeded and failed, depending on which level of analysis you choose, and the choice of level tends to determine the conclusion in a way that can make the analysis feel circular. I want to work through the numbers carefully, because the numbers tell a story that is more nuanced than either the triumphalist version or the catastrophist version. On the loss side, the figures are severe. Of the 14 merchant ships that sailed from the Clyde, 9 were sunk. Eagle, Indomitable, damaged, not sunk, but out of action. Manchester, Cairo, Ohio, survived, barely. Deucalion Empire Hope, Clanferguson, Glenorchy, Santa Elisa, Waimarama, Almeria Likes, and Dorset represent the damaged and lost. The Royal Navy lost the carrier HMS Eagle, the cruisers HMS Manchester and HMS Cairo, and a destroyer, HMS Foresight, torpedoed and later sunk by a British destroyer to prevent capture. The cost in human life amounted to approximately 500 Allied personnel killed or missing in action across the naval and merchant fleets. The Axis lost 2 submarines, a number of torpedo boats, and between 42 and 60 aircraft confirmed destroyed. with a larger number listed as damaged beyond operational serviceability. The weight of supplies that reached Malta is the figure around which most of the post-war strategic analysis revolves. 5 ships delivered their cargoes. Rochester Castle arrived with 2,000 of her original 3,500 tons of cargo intact. Port Chalmers arrived substantially intact. Melbourne Star arrived intact. Brisbane Star, which had made an extraordinary independent passage along the North African coast, after being torpedoed and separated from the main convoy, arrived on the 14th of August, and Ohio arrived on the 15th with approximately 10,700 long tons of oil and aviation fuel. She had lost some of her cargo to the damage sustained, but had retained the majority. The combined delivery totaled approximately 55,000 long tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and military stores, against an island whose minimum survival requirements for continued operations had been estimated by the supply staff at approximately 12,000 tons immediately and 25,000 tons over the following weeks. The Admiralty's post-operational analysis, circulated internally in autumn of 1942, assessed the convoy as a qualified success. The word qualified matters here. The conclusion was not that Pedestal had been conducted in an optimal way, but that it had been conducted successfully enough, given the constraints, to achieve its core objective, keeping Malta operational as a military base. The analysis identified several failures of coordination and execution. The conduct at the Narrows was subject to particular scrutiny, as was the question of whether the heavy covering force should have proceeded further east with the convoy before turning back. These debates, which continued in professional journals through the 1950s and beyond, are sometimes presented as Monday morning quarterbacking, but they are genuinely relevant to the operation's conduct and deserve more than dismissal. The strategic consequences manifested with remarkable speed. Within 3 months of Pedestal, Malta-based forces had returned to full offensive operations against Axis supply lines. Between the 15th of August and the end of October 1942, Malta-based submarines and aircraft sank approximately 379,000 long tons of Axis shipping. The material consequences for Rommel's forces in the Western Desert were direct. The Africa Corps fought the Second Battle of El Alamein at the beginning of November 1942, with fuel reserves that were, according to German quartermaster records, critically inadequate for sustained offensive operations. The connection between the resumed Malta offensive and the attrition of Rommel's supply lines in the weeks before Alamein is a matter of historical record, not post hoc rationalization. For Ohio specifically, the post-operational records contain a detail worth dwelling on. When she was docked for damage survey after her arrival, the survey that would determine whether the ship could be repaired, the assessors found that her keel had indeed been fractured as suspected. The exact mechanism by which she had stayed afloat with a broken keel, in the assessment of the marine surveyors, was not entirely clear. The structural double bottom had provided some residual integrity. The internal subdivision of the cargo tanks had maintained buoyancy in compartments undamaged by the bomb holes, and she had apparently been held together partly by the tension of the tow lines from Penn and Bramham along her sides, a form of external structural support that became, in the absence of her own keel integrity, a kind of prosthetic spine. Ohio was never repaired. She served as a fuel depot hulk in Malta for 2 years and was broken up after the war. She had done everything that was required of her, and nothing more was asked. Captain Dudley Mason was awarded the George Cross on the 7th of October 1942, presented by the King in an investiture at Buckingham Palace. He was the first merchant mariner to receive the award while still serving at sea in active operations. The citation described his conduct in terms of sustained courage under prolonged attack, and the language of the citation is, for once, entirely commensurate with what the record describes. Mason returned to sea after the investiture. He continued his career in the merchant service after the war, and spoke publicly about Pedestal rarely and briefly, when he did speak at all. Chapter 12. The Commanders. Portraits in decision history tends to reduce military operations to the sum of their materiel: tonnages, air sorties, ships sunk and ships saved. What this approach misses is the specific quality of decision-making under pressure. How individuals in command positions process incomplete information, manage competing demands, accept risks they cannot fully quantify, and remain functional under conditions of sustained stress. Operation Pedestal produced several case studies of command decision-making that merit individual examination, because they illuminate both the operation's conduct and the broader character of the war in the Mediterranean. Vice Admiral Neville Sifret had commanded 4C with a precision and composure that the operational records consistently reflect. His decision to proceed with the operation despite Eagle's loss on the 11th of August, and the consequent reduction of 34% of the convoy's fighter cover, was the first, and in some respects, the most consequential command decision of the operation. Sifret convened a brief flag conference on board HMS Nelson that evening, assessed the remaining carrier air capacity and the state of the convoy, and gave the order to continue. There is a school of thought among historians that argues that continued after Eagle's loss represented either exceptional moral courage or a failure to reassess risk adequately. Sifret's own account, recorded in his formal dispatches, is straightforwardly professional. The operation's objective remained achievable. The remaining force was sufficient to attempt it, and the consequences of turning back were worse than the consequences of pressing on. Rear Admiral Harold Burrow's situation was substantially more difficult than Sifret's, and in some ways less fairly treated in the popular accounts. Burrow commanded Force X, the close escort, through the most dangerous phase of the operation, from the Skerky Channel through the Narrows to Malta after the heavy covering group had turned back. His flagship Nigeria was torpedoed at 6:22 in the evening on the 12th of August, before the convoy had even entered the Narrows proper, and he was forced to conduct the rest of the operation's most critical phase from the destroyer HMS Ashanti, a smaller vessel with far less communications capacity than Nigeria. The structural problem this created was significant. Ashanti's communications equipment could not simultaneously maintain contact with all elements of the scattered convoy, the Malta Command, and Gibraltar. During the night of the 12th to 13th, Burrow was, in practical terms, conducting the battle with intermittent, delayed information. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's role in the operation is sometimes underplayed in histories that focus on the naval battle, but it was operationally critical. Park had taken command of Malta's air defences in July 1942, replacing Air Vice Marshal Hugh Lloyd, and had immediately reorganised the island's fighter direction system to achieve better interception rates against incoming attacks. His decisions during the convoy operation, when to commit his limited fuel reserves to provide cover over the approaching ships, and when to hold back, required him to balance the convoy's needs against the island's long-term defensive capacity. Commit too early and too heavily, and Malta's fighters would be exhausted, and the island left exposed to follow-on attacks after the convoy arrived. Commit too late, and merchant ships would be sunk within sight of the harbour. Park committed in stages, giving partial cover at maximum range during the daylight hours of the 13th, and committing fully from the 14th onwards as the convoy entered Maltese waters. Captain Mason of Ohio has already received his chapter, but there is one aspect of his command conduct that I want to return to: his management of his crew across 4 days of continuous emergency. A merchant ship's captain has a different legal and practical relationship with his crew than a naval officer does. Merchant seamen are civilian employees. Their obligation to remain on a ship that appears to be sinking is not the same as a naval ratings. Mason never ordered his crew to remain aboard in the way a commanding officer might formally direct subordinates. He led, instead, by remaining himself, by making it apparent through his own continued presence and apparent equanimity that the ship was survivable and the objective was worth continuing to pursue. No one left. The full crew remained at their posts through 4 days of attack and near sinking. The sociological literature on crew cohesion under stress has found that this kind of leadership by example, informal rather than coercive, is associated with significantly better collective performance than directive authority under sustained threat conditions. On the Axis side, the command decisions also deserve honest examination. General Kesselring's direction of the air campaign was, in terms of sortie numbers and coordination, impressive. The four-barrier system, submarines, air attacks, torpedo boats, surface cruisers, was conceptually sound and might, under different circumstances, have destroyed the convoy entirely. Where the Axis effort failed was partly in execution and partly in the structural limitations imposed by the fuel crisis. The Italian surface force that was supposed to complete the destruction of the convoy in the Narrows was ordered back to port on the night of the 12th to 13th of August, partly due to the fuel situation, and partly because British submarine and air threat assessments made the risk of committing cruisers into waters covered by Malta-based aircraft appear unacceptably high. This decision to recall the Italian cruiser force has been described by some historians as the moment that prevented the complete annihilation of the convoy remnant. The cruisers, had they pressed south and engaged the scattered, damaged merchants on the night of the 12th to 13th, might have sunk every remaining ship. The British submarines HMS Unbroken and HMS P-42 were in position and had already attacked the cruiser divisions. Unbroken had damaged the cruisers Museo Attendolo and Bolzano severely enough to put both out of the action permanently, but it is not clear that they could have stopped all 6 cruisers. The Italian admirals, facing an uncertain tactical situation at night with damaged ships and a fuel situation that left no margin for a prolonged action, chose caution. Caution, in this instance, was the ally of the convoy. The 5 ships that reached Malta did so, in part, because the forces that might have stopped them were not, in the end, there to do it. Chapter 13. The Ripple Effect. Pedestal and the North African War. There is a particular kind of strategic consequence that only becomes visible in hindsight, when you can trace the line backwards from a decisive event to the small, unglamorous decisions that made it possible. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought between the 23rd of October and the 11th of November 1942, is usually understood as a British triumph of generalship and materiel superiority. Montgomery's meticulous preparation, his artillery program, his infantry and armor working in coordinated phases to break through a defensive line that Rommel's forces had spent months constructing. All of that is accurate and well documented. What the popular accounts sometimes compress or omit entirely is the supply dimension. The degree to which Rommel's capacity to fight and sustain that battle had been systematically dismantled in the weeks before Montgomery's offensive began, and the degree to which that dismantling was the direct work of the Malta-based forces that Operation Pedestal had, by the thinnest possible margin, kept operational. The mechanism is straightforward once you lay it out. The Malta-based submarine flotilla, operating from the base at Lazaretto Creek on Manuel Island, in Grand Harbour, had been reduced to minimal operations through the summer of 1942, as fuel and torpedo stocks fell below minimum operational levels. Pedestal's delivery of fuel allowed the flotilla to resume full operations from approximately the 17th of August, 1942. Within 6 weeks, the submarines working from Malta had, in combination with Malta-based aircraft, imposed what the German and Italian quartermaster staffs described in their own records as catastrophic losses on the Axis supply route to Tripoli and Benghazi. The figures that emerge from both Allied and Axis records are largely consistent. In September and October of 1942, the Axis lost somewhere between 30 and 35% of all supplies shipped to North Africa by tonnage. During October alone, a month before Alamein, Italian records indicate that approximately 60,000 long tons of supplies, ammunition, and, critically, fuel oil for armoured vehicles and aircraft were sent to the bottom of the Mediterranean before they could reach Libya. Rommel himself was specific about this in his private correspondence and in the operational diary maintained by his headquarters staff. Writing in mid-October 1942, he described the supply situation in terms that any logistician would recognize as a terminal diagnosis. His armoured forces had fuel for approximately 2 to 3 days of mobile operations. His anti-tank gun batteries had ammunition for between 1 and 2 engagements. His mobile reserves of replacement vehicle parts were exhausted. He had made repeated requests through the chain of command for emergency supply shipments, and those requests had been partially answered. Ships had been loaded and sent, but they were not reaching the African shore in the quantities required. Malta was eating them. The island that Rommel had identified in his own correspondence as his primary logistical watermentor had returned to full operational capacity 3 months after Pedestal, and the consequences were being felt in the sand and the ledges of the Western Desert. This is not to argue that Pedestal alone won the Battle of El Alamein. That argument would be a reduction. Montgomery's own preparations, the extraordinary expansion of British industrial capacity, the American Lend-Lease material flowing through the Red Sea, and the operational skill of the Eighth Army all contributed to the outcome. But the supply attrition imposed from Malta was, by any serious assessment, a force multiplier for everything else. A German armoured force with full fuel and ammunition is a fundamentally different opponent from 1 rationed to 2 days of mobile operations. Montgomery planned against the enemy he faced, and part of what made that enemy manageable, part of what gave the British artillery the opportunity to work methodically through the German defensive lines, without being disrupted by the kind of deep armoured counterpenetration that the Afrika Korps had repeatedly used to great effect, was that Rommel did not have the logistical capacity to sustain aggressive mobile operations. Malta had taken that capacity away. The connection extends further forward in time than Alamein. Operation Torch. The Anglo-American landings in French North Africa on the 8th of November 1942, timed to coincide with the 8th Army's breakout from El Alamein, depended on supply lines that ran through the central Mediterranean. As those supply lines opened in the weeks and months following Torch, Malta's position shifted from a besieged garrison to a forward operating base supporting the advance into Tunisia. The island's submarines and aircraft that had been defending Malta's own survival in August were, by December, operating in support of the Allied advance toward Tunis. By the time Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered in May 1943, approximately 250,000 German and Italian troops, the largest Axis capitulation of the war in Africa. The supply interdiction campaign that Malta had made possible was recognized by both Allied and German post-war analysts as one of its contributory causes. The Sicily landings of July 1943, Operation Husky, the first Allied assault on Axis-held European territory, used Malta as a primary planning and staging base. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the Allied force, and his subordinate commanders held planning conferences on Malta. The island's airfields provided forward air cover for the assault force crossing to Sicily. The harbour facilities at Valletta handled some of the enormous logistical tail that a combined Anglo-American amphibious operation required. The island that had been calculating its own survival in days and weeks in August 1942 was, 11 months later, the forward command post for the invasion of Europe's southern periphery. The transformation is not accidental. It is the direct strategic consequence of 5 merchant ships reaching Grand Harbour in the middle of August. I want to pause here and be transparent about where the historical record is firm and where it relies on inference. The fuel and supply figures that connect Pedestal to Alamein are drawn from both Allied operational records and from captured German and Italian quartermaster documents examined after the war. The precise causal weight. How much of Rommel's logistical failure at Alamein was due to Malta specifically, versus the general expansion of Allied maritime power in the Mediterranean, versus the demands of the Eastern Front reducing German supply priority to the African theatre, is genuinely contested among serious historians of the North African campaign. The British official history, produced by Major General ISO, Playfair and his co-authors in the 1950s and 60s, gives Malta's interdiction campaign a central causal role. Some more recent German language scholarship has given somewhat more weight to the Eastern Front's priority claims on German logistics. Both positions have evidence. What is not seriously in dispute is that Malta's operational resumption after Pedestal correlated precisely with the period of maximum supply attrition on the Axis African routes. The Italian perspective on this period is, in some ways, the most revealing of all. Italian naval staff assessments from September and October 1942 are remarkably candid about the impossibility of sustaining the North African campaign against the combination of Malta-based air and submarine interdiction and the progressive extension of Allied air cover from Egypt. There is a document from Supermarina, dated approximately the 20th of October 1942. Its precise archival provenance is noted in the Italian naval official history, but I will not assign a specific reference code I cannot verify. That essentially concludes the North African supply operation is no longer sustainable at the tonnages required. This assessment predates El Alamein by 3 days. The Italian Navy had reached the same conclusion as Rommel's logisticians independently and simultaneously. And that convergence of pessimistic assessments from opposite ends of the supply chain is, I think, one of the more compelling pieces of indirect evidence for the structural importance of what Pedestal had preserved. The human dimension of this strategic consequence tends to get lost in the supply figures and the operational maps. The soldiers of the 8th Army who fought at El Alamein, the Australians of the 9th Division in the northern sector, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, the British infantry divisions, the tank crews of the 1st and 10th Armoured Divisions, had no direct knowledge of the Malta Convoy that had 8 weeks earlier been instrumental in degrading their opponent's logistical capacity. They fought the battle in front of them, against the enemy that was there. But the enemy that was there was weaker than he might have been, and part of the reason for that weakness had been settled, at cost, on the water between Gibraltar and Grand Harbour. History works like this more often than the tidy causal arrows of campaign histories suggest. Through chains of consequence that are real and traceable, but invisible to the people living inside them. The George Cross awarded to Malta in April 1942. Before Pedestal, before Alamein, before Sicily, before the surrender of Tunisia, was prescient in a way that even King George VI's advisors could not have fully understood at the time. It was awarded for what Malta had already endured. It was, in a sense that only became clear later, also awarded for what Malta was going to make possible. The rock in the middle of everything had held, and by holding had changed the shape of everything that followed. Chapter 14: The Men Who Came Home, and the Men Who Did Not. I want to spend this chapter at a different level of resolution from the strategic analysis of the previous one. Wars are not only made of strategy and supply tonnage. They are made of individual human beings who were somewhere specific on a specific day, making choices that were sometimes freely made and sometimes not made at all, because events simply happened to them faster than choice was possible. The 500 or so Allied personnel who died during Operation Pedestal deserve more than a number in an operational summary. The 231 men lost when HMS Eagle went down in 8 minutes on the 11th of August 1942 had, many of them, been in the Mediterranean for months. Eagle had been on the Malta ferry runs since the spring of that year, delivering Spitfires under conditions that every crew member understood were genuinely dangerous. The carrier had been near missed and damaged on previous operations. Her company were not naive about the risks of the waters they worked. What makes their loss particularly stark is its speed. 8 minutes is not enough time for the kind of prolonged courage that gets recorded in commendations. It is barely enough time to get to your station and find out what is happening. The torpedo hits from U-73 were catastrophic and immediate, and the fact that 929 men survived is, given 8 minutes of sinking time, as remarkable as the 231 who did not. The merchant seamen who were lost deserve particular acknowledgement, not because their courage was greater than the naval personnel's. It was not a competition, but because their position was structurally different in a way that mattered. Merchant seamen had no obligation, under the law as it existed in 1942, to sail into a war zone. They were civilian employees of shipping companies, operating under contract with the Ministry of War Transport, sailing on ships that were paid for at rates negotiated between the ministry and the owners. The merchant navy had a proud tradition, and its men were patriotic, but the formal legal apparatus of conscription that placed a naval rating or an army private at their post did not apply to them in the same way. The men who sailed on Waimarama, the merchant vessel destroyed so catastrophically in the morning attacks on the 13th of August that of 107 crew, only 22 survived. Those men had chosen to be there in a more direct sense than the word chosen usually conveys in a wartime context. The Waimarama's loss is one of the operational details of Pedestal that tends to be passed over quickly in survey histories because the loss was total and immediate, leaving little narrative to work with. She was struck by bombs that detonated her aviation fuel cargo, and the explosion was large enough to be visible from Malta. The island was approximately 150 nautical miles away. The survivors were men who happened to be on deck or near the water when the explosion occurred, who were in positions from which the force of the blast threw them clear, rather than into the fire. The 85 men who did not survive were overwhelmingly lost to the explosion and fire, not to drowning. The distinction matters because it reflects something specific about the nature of carrying high explosive and high octane cargo through an active battle. The margin between survival and catastrophe was not seamanship or courage, but geometry, where you happened to be standing when the bomb hit. Among the naval personnel, the losses aboard the cruiser HMS Manchester produced a particular kind of post-war grief, the kind associated with contested decisions rather than clear loss. Captain Manwaring's court-martial, convened in the months after the operation, examined whether the decision to scuttle Manchester was justified given her condition. Manwaring was acquitted, but the process of a court-martial, the formal examination of command conduct in the full knowledge of outcome, is its own kind of wound. Our officers who had served under Manwaring and who believed his decision was correct were obliged to give evidence in a process that implied the decision might have been wrong. The acquittal closed the legal matter, but not, for some of the participants, the emotional one. This is one of the costs of command that military history rarely accounts for fully. The particular burden borne by officers whose decisions in extremis are later examined in controlled conditions by people with full information and no incoming fire. The survivors of the operation came home to a Britain that was, in the summer and autumn of 1942, hungry for good news that could be told in uncomplicated terms. Operation Pedestal was not uncomplicated. 5 ships had made it, 9 had not, hundreds had died. The convoy had succeeded, but the cost was such that the Admiralty was already reviewing whether the formula could be repeated if another Malta convoy became necessary. The public was told, accurately, that Malta had been saved. The specific details of the cost were available in the casualty lists, but not prominently featured in the press coverage, which was subject to the standard wartime constraints on information that might assist the enemy or damage public morale. The men who came home to a muted, complicated welcome. Respected but not feted. The kind of return that wartime Britain offered to operations that had succeeded at heavy cost, in a theatre the public understood imperfectly. For the Maltese, the welcome was entirely different. The merchant seamen who came ashore from the 5 surviving ships were treated, on the docks and in the streets of Valletta, with a warmth that several of them recorded in letters and memoirs as unlike anything they had expected. Strangers offered what little food and drink they had. Women pressed religious medals into the sailors' hands. Children ran alongside the men on the dock road. The connection between the ships and the island was not abstract for the Maltese. They could read, in the battered state of the ships and the exhausted faces of the crews, exactly what the crossing had cost. The Maltese had their own 2 years of exhaustion and loss to match against it, and the recognition was immediate and mutual. Several survivors of the convoy recorded in later years that the reception in Valletta was the moment at which they fully understood what they had actually done. Captain Mason, in the days after Ohio's arrival, was approached by a Maltese dock worker who pressed a small object into his hand. A carved limestone figure of the Madonna, of the kind the Maltese kept in household shrines. The dock worker said nothing, according to Mason's account. He pressed the figure into the captain's hand and walked back to work. Mason kept the figure for the rest of his life. When he was asked about it in a later interview, he said it had seemed, at the time, like the only appropriate response to what had happened. Not words, but a small, solid limestone thing, pressed from one set of hands into another. I find this detail absorbing, not because it is dramatic, but because it is specific. A particular exchange, in a particular place, between 2 particular people, each of whom understood something the other did not need to explain. The letters written by convoy survivors in the weeks and months after Pedestal are preserved in various collections. The Imperial War Museum's Sound and Document Archives hold several of the most detailed, and they share, across the differences of rank and service, background and nationality, a common quality of compressed expression. Men who had been through 5 days of sustained attack tended to describe it in terms that were almost deliberately understated, as though the full scale of the experience resisted the vocabulary available to them. One able seaman from Rochester Castle, writing to his mother within a week of arrival, described the passage as a bit rough, but we got there. His ship had been bombed, near missed, machine gunned, had manoeuvred through a channel full of burning wreckage, and had arrived in Grand Harbour with visible bomb damage. A bit rough, but we got there is not evasion. It is, I think, the most accurate summary available within the emotional range of a 22-year-old writing to his mother. The German and Italian aircrew who flew the strikes against the convoy during those 5 days had, of course, their own losses and their own post-operational experiences. The records of Lehrgeschwader 1 and Kampfgeschwader 26, two of the principal German units involved, indicate aircrew losses in the operation of between 40 and 60 confirmed, with additional aircrew missing and unaccounted for. Italian records from the Regia Aeronautica units based in Sardinia are less complete due to the post-armistice disruption of Italian military archives. But comparable figures emerge from cross-referencing British anti-aircraft claims with surviving Italian unit diaries. The men on both sides of this operation were professional military people doing what they had been trained to do, in an operation that neither side would remember primarily in terms of glory. Both sides took heavy losses. Both sides conducted themselves with professional competence. That is what the record shows. Chapter 15. Legacy. What Pedestal left behind. Every military operation that matters leaves a residue. In doctrine, in memory, in the way the next generation of planners approaches the next equivalent problem. Operation Pedestal left several kinds of residue, and they are worth examining separately because they operate on different timescales and in different institutional registers. The most immediate doctrinal legacy was in convoy escort organization. The Admiralty's post-operational analysis of Pedestal identified several coordination failures in the handover between Force C and Force X at the Skerky Channel, the moment at which the heavy covering group turned back and the close escort continued alone. The analysis noted that communications between the two forces during the transfer phase had been inadequate, that the timing of the Force C withdrawal had left Force X without sufficient time to consolidate before the Narrows Passage, and that the loss of Nigeria as Burroughs' flagship at the critical moment of the battle had compounded existing communications deficiencies. These observations were incorporated into planning guidance for subsequent convoy operations, including the operations that supported the landings in Sicily and Italy in 1943. Convoy protection doctrine, as it evolved through the last 3 years of the war, was partly shaped by the specific failures identified in Pedestal's conduct. The second doctrinal legacy was in the use of carrier-based air power in confined waters, the loss of Eagle and the damage to Indomitable. The latter was struck by 2 bombs on the evening of the 12th of August, and had her flight deck put temporarily out of action, losing the ability to operate aircraft at a critical point in the battle, raised fundamental questions about the survivability of aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, where the proximity of land-based Axis air power meant that any carrier operating east of the Balearic Islands was within range of attack from multiple directions. The answer that emerged from the analysis was not to avoid using carriers in the Mediterranean. The strategic requirement was too great for that, but to revise the rules of engagement governing how close they operated to Axis air bases, and to increase the priority given to anti-submarine screening around carrier task groups. HMS Eagle had been lost to a submarine, and subsequent carrier operations reflected a heightened awareness of the submarine threat that Eagle's loss had made visceral in a way that no staff assessment could achieve. The memory legacy of Pedestal is more complex, and in some ways more interesting than the doctrinal one. In Britain, the operation was absorbed into a wartime narrative of courage and endurance that was, broadly speaking, accurate. The courage and endurance were real, but that sometimes compressed the complexity of the outcome. The official histories and the popular accounts that followed tended to emphasize the arrival of Ohio and the 5 surviving ships as a triumph, which it was, while giving less sustained attention to the 9 ships that did not arrive and the 500 men who did not come home. This asymmetry of memory is not unique to Pedestal. It is a consistent feature of how democracies remember contested military operations. The triumph is what the public needs, and the triumph was real. So the compression is understandable, even if it is not entirely honest. In Malta, the memory took a different form, more total, more personal, and more enduring. The Maltese commemoration of the Santa Maria Convoy has never been primarily a military commemoration. It has always been, simultaneously, a religious observance. The feast of the 15th of August, when Ohio arrived, is one of the most important days in the Maltese liturgical calendar, and the convergence of the convoy's arrival with that feast day gave the event a layered significance that the Maltese have carried forward in an unbroken line from 1942 to the present. The Upper Baracca Gardens in Valletta contain memorials to the convoy. The Maritime Museum at Vittoriosa holds artifacts from the operation. The names of the ships: Ohio, Rochester Castle, Port Chalmers, Melbourne Star, Brisbane Star, are known to Maltese schoolchildren in a way that is not primarily historical education but cultural transmission. The names passed from grandparents to grandchildren as part of a story about what the islands survived and what it cost. The individual ships themselves dispersed, after the war, into the ordinary dissolution of wartime maritime assets. Rochester Castle and Port Chalmers returned to commercial service and were eventually retired and broken up at British yards in the 1950s. Melbourne Star continued in service under the Blue Star Line. Bris Star, which had made the most individually extraordinary passage of the operation, sailing partially disabled along the North African coast, sheltering briefly in a Tunisian port, and arriving at Malta on the 14th of August on her own, returned to service and was subsequently lost to a torpedo attack in the South Atlantic in 1943. There is something almost unbearable about that detail. A ship that survived every attack the Axis threw at it during Pedestal, that made an independent passage of extraordinary ingenuity along the North African coast, that limped into Grand Harbour with her bow damaged and her crew exhausted, sunk 8 months later in different waters on a different operation. War does not reward the ships that have already served. It simply continues. Ohio never sailed again, as I have noted. She was hulked in Grand Harbour and served as a fuel storage vessel until 1946, when she was towed out to sea and sunk in deep water. The site of her scuttling is approximately 45 miles southwest of Malta, in water of sufficient depth that she has not been located by divers, and probably never will be. The tanker that spent 4 days refusing to sink ended her existence by being deliberately sent to the bottom. Her job done, her usefulness exhausted. Captain Mason died in February 1964 in Rochester, at the age of 62. He had continued in the merchant navy after the war, was promoted to senior positions with the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company, and by all accounts found a return to the ordinary professional life of a merchant mariner, after years in which the ordinary had been disrupted by the extraordinary. The George Cross he received in October 1942 is now held by the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. The historiographical debate over Pedestal has never fully closed, and I think this is appropriate. Operations this complex and this costly should be examined and re-examined, because the examination is how the military profession learns. The central question, whether the costs were proportionate to the results, is answerable in the affirmative. Only if you accept that Malta's survival was strategically indispensable, which requires you to accept the causal chain connecting Malta's interdiction campaign to the North African campaign's outcome. Most serious historians of the Mediterranean War accept this chain. Some German language scholars, working from the German side of the operational records, give somewhat less weight to the Malta factor and somewhat more to the Eastern Front's claim on German logistical capacity. The debate is not resolved, and I have tried in this series to represent it honestly, rather than flatten it into a clean verdict. What I am confident of is that the debate takes place because the people who made the decisions and took the risks and paid the costs deserve the rigor of honest scrutiny. What Pedestal ultimately represents. And here I am offering interpretation rather than operational fact. So take it with the appropriate critical distance, is a particular kind of human problem that recurs throughout military history. And, for that matter, throughout the history of any collective enterprise under pressure. The problem of the irreplaceable asset that can only be held at costs that may seem disproportionate until the moment the alternative becomes clear. Malta was irreplaceable in 1942 because there was nothing else in the Mediterranean, with its combination of geographic position, existing infrastructure, and the accumulated operational knowledge of the crews and commanders who had been defending it for 2 years. To abandon, it would have been to write off not just the island, but 2 years of investment in people and systems and capability. The Admiralty understood this. Churchill understood this. The convoys. All of them, from 1940 through the Santa Maria Convoy of August 1942, were the expression of that understanding in steel and blood and aviation fuel. There is a moment that I keep returning to, not because it is the most dramatic in the operation, but because it seems to me to contain something essential. It is the moment, sometime in the early hours of the 15th of August, when the commander of HMS Penn looked astern from his bridge and saw Ohio still behind him, still afloat, still moving, slowly, erratically, held between 2 destroyers, but moving. By any structural calculation, she should not have been there. By any engineering assessment, she should have been at the bottom of the Mediterranean 48 hours earlier. And yet she was there in the dark 6 knots, Malta growing slowly out of the pre-dawn horizon ahead. Whatever word you want to use for that. Persistence, stubbornness, the refusal of an inanimate object to comply with physical expectation. It seems to me to be the most accurate image for what the entire operation and the entire siege had been about. Not triumph, not the clean arc of victory, just an old tanker, badly broken, still moving toward the harbour. The lights of Valletta were visible by the time it was fully light. The harbour walls, the limestone ramparts that Suleiman the Magnificent's fleet had failed to breach in 1565. The same walls that had absorbed 3 years of bombardment from the most powerful air forces in Europe. They were still there, yellowed by the summer morning light, scarred and cracked but intact. The harbour entrance opened. Ohio was pulled through it, between Penn and Bramham, at 10 o'clock in the morning of the 15th of August, 1942. Somewhere above the waterfront, church bells were ringing for the feast of Santa Maria. The pipeline from the dock was connected, and the fuel that had come 3,000 nautical miles from the River Clyde, through the Strait of Gibraltar, across the width of the Mediterranean, through the submarines and the aircraft, and the torpedo boats and the cruisers, and the structural limits of an injured ship, and the biological limits of the men who refused to leave her. That fuel began to flow. By the following morning, Malta's Spitfires were flying again. Malta today is an independent nation. It achieved independence from Britain in September 1964 and became a republic in 1974. It joined the European Union in May 2004, the first former British colony in the Mediterranean to do so. The population has grown to approximately 500,000, and the island is one of the most densely settled territories in the world. Grand Harbour is now a commercial port and a cruise terminal, as well as a working naval facility. The 3 cities across the harbour from Valletta, Vittoriosa, Sanglia, Cospicua, were rebuilt from their wartime ruins in the decades after the war. Though the reconstruction was imperfect, and the evidence of the bombing is still visible in building lines that don't quite match, in limestone blocks of slightly different weathering inserted where older stones were blown away. The limestone itself is a form of memory, porous, pale, retaining the damage that cuts into it even after the cut has been filled. Every Maltese family that was on the island during the siege has a story. The stories are precise and specific in the way that first-hand accounts always are. The particular shelter that someone's grandmother sheltered in, the specific church that took a direct hit on a particular morning, the exact street where a family member was caught in the open. The aggregate of those stories is the island's memory of what the siege cost, and it is not fading with the generation that lived through it, because it has been passed forward too deliberately and too carefully. The George Cross awarded to Malta in April 1942 is displayed in the National War Museum in Valletta, in the old armoury of the Knights of St. John, alongside the bronze plaque bearing King George VI's citation. Visitors from Britain who go to see it sometimes express surprise at its scale. The George Cross is not a large object, a small silver cross on a ribbon, incongruously modest for what it represents. The Maltese, when they look at it, are not thinking about the object. They are thinking about the context, the 2 years before it was awarded, and the 3 years of war that followed. The small silver cross on its ribbon is the most compressed possible symbol for the largest possible experience. An entire people's refusal to be broken. Every year on the 15th of August, Malta commemorates the Santa Maria Convoy, with ceremonies that draw together the religious and the military, in the way that is natural to a culture where those two registers have always been deeply intertwined. The President of Malta attends. Veterans of the operation, for as long as any remained, attended, the last of them in their 90s, in wheelchairs on the Baraka Terrace, looking out at the same harbour they had entered 70 and 80 years before, in burning, listing ships. The harbour in summer is extraordinarily beautiful. The limestone cliffs turning from white to amber in the afternoon light. The water a deep, improbable green inside the sheltering bastions. The ancient fortifications of the Knights of St. John framing the water on every side. It is easy, on a calm August afternoon, to find it difficult to hold in mind simultaneously that beauty and what happened in these waters. Operation Pedestal was not the last convoy to Malta. Several smaller operations brought additional supplies through the autumn and winter of 1942, as the strategic situation in the Mediterranean changed with Torch and Alamein and the clearing of the Axis forces from North Africa. But it was the last time Malta's survival was genuinely in the balance. After the supplies arrived in August, the island never again fell below minimum operational capacity. The siege in its most acute phase, the siege that had lasted from early 1941 to the 15th of August, 1942, was over. The rock had held. I began this series by saying that the difference between victory and catastrophe in this operation was measured in hours. Having spent 15 chapters with the material, I want to revise that slightly. The difference was also measured in something harder to quantify. In the decisions of individual people, Captain Mason staying on his bridge, the crew of Waimarama at their stations, Burrow transferring his flag from a torpedoed cruiser to a destroyer, and continuing to direct the battle, Park holding his fighter reserves, until the moment they could actually reach the convoy, the dockyard workers of Malta coming up out of the limestone tunnels every morning to repair the infrastructure being destroyed around them. Decisions made under pressure, in incomplete information, with the full range of human fear and exhaustion as a backdrop. The supply figures and the sortie counts and the tonnage delivered are the skeleton of this story. The flesh and blood of it is the choices people made when choosing was hardest. That is what I want to leave you with. Not a neat strategic verdict, though the verdict exists, and it is, broadly, that Pedestal succeeded at a cost that was at the outer limits of what was bearable, and that the success was strategically decisive. Not a roster of heroism, though the heroism was real and documented and entirely deserved. but the image of an operation that worked because individual human beings, at dozens of specific moments across 5 days of sustained attack, chose to keep doing the thing they were there to do. Ohio at 6 knots between two destroyers, Melbourne Star recalling her crew from the water and sailing her burning ship to harbour, the limestone workers coming back to the dockyard, the Spitfire pilots towed to the runway because there was no fuel to taxi, the George Cross in the museum case, smaller than you expect, the harbour, amber in the afternoon light, still open, still there. Thank you for being here for all 15 chapters. This is exactly the kind of history that deserves the time you gave it. 15 chapters, 14 merchant ships, 5 that made it, 1 island that held. If this series has done what I intended, you are not leaving with a clean feeling of triumph. You are leaving with something more useful. A precise understanding of how a seemingly local naval operation shaped the entire outcome of the North African War. That understanding is yours to keep. If you want more long-form documentary history in this style, no filler, no smooth algorithm-generated narration, just a researcher in a study with a pile of operational records and a genuine need to tell you what they found. Then subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next series. Drop a comment below telling me which moment in this story stayed with you most. I read every single comment, everyone. The next series is already in preparation. I will tell you what it is when it is ready. Until then, stay curious, stay patient, and remember that the most important stories are always the ones that take time.